Hey everyone, and welcome back to the news. It's been an interesting week with Age of Darkness catching on and the race to World First kicking off, so there's a lot to talk about today, both with the race and also, of course, lore and game design. Then, of course, this is our first news show of this month. Somehow means we've got a new Patreon theme, and this month it is Rogue. So yeah, these are fun. You get your big art card, we've got our lovely Raven, then of course a high-quality vinyl sticker. They're made by the art team of our game dev studio that's just like through the wall behind me. $25 a month helps us out a whole bunch, shipping included. And yeah, a massive thank you to everyone who supports us over on Patreon. So, with that, let's get into Age of Darkness. Yes, the leak that supposedly has caught the whole internet by storm. Now, this was just everywhere this week, so I thought, why not take a look? At the very least, we get to speculate about the future of the game, and there's a lot of lore topics that are quite likely that we will talk about. So, the name, Age of Darkness. According to the leak, that is a working title for the next X-Pack, which I suppose sounds reasonable-ish for a working title for a game. Now, where things get a bit more realistic is the level squish. Yes, this claims that the vanilla zones will cover level 1 through 20, while TBC, Wrath, and Kata will be 20 to 30, Mop and Wad will be 30 to 40, Legion and BFA 40 to 50, and then AOD's leveling covering 50 to 60. Overall, this does sound very plausible given what we already know about the leveling squish. So, Ian Hazacostas floated the idea months ago during a Q&A, and then more recently, an official Blizzard survey asked players if they were aware of the next expansion's level squish. Now, that was fairly surprising because it was the first we'd heard about that. It was the first confirmation we had heard, and oddly enough, Blizzard have said nothing about it since. So really, the whole thing is just rather up in the air right now. And really, when you think about the sort of anatomy of a leak, well, including something like this would make sense. But anyway, moving on, Tinkerers are apparently the game's new class. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me given Mecha gone, and apparently Mechagnomes and Gill Goblins will be the associated allied races, with Goblins, Gnomes, Forsaken, and Draenei being the other playable ones. And they would have 2 specs, Explosives, and Combat Medic. Now, those spec names, they're pretty bad, so I assume they're whip, but, I mean, yeah, the overall thing, I think it could be vaguely real. I think it's all plausible. Though Gill Goblins seem like a bit of a strange one, considering the tech. I would have just thought Mecha Goblins would maybe opt in to being like the Mechagnomes. But anyway, as for the setting, well, supposedly N'Zoth will spring his big trap as the Alliance and Horde fight at Thunderbluff following the events of the war campaign. And after that, his next goal will be to free Cthulhu, but not how you'd think. Apparently, he wants to destroy the Bronze Dragonflight and turn Norse Dumu into Morozond so that he can alter the timeline to prevent Cthulhu from being defeated in Ahn'Qiraj. Now, I think the interruption of the Alliance Horde finale of this current expansion makes sense, but I don't think Blizzard will want to get seriously involved in time travel again. Plus, we already know how Morozond was created, so this would either retcon that, or would maybe have the transformation happen earlier on in Norse Dumu's life. Either way, it's time travel. It would be very messy. Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I don't think so. Anyway, Xal'atath is also set to have a major role as an antagonist to the old gods, being a sort of neutral evil character according to the post, which I pretty much take to mean chaotic neutral, and she would apparently be sort of mentoring us, helping us fight the old gods, I guess a little bit like Locust Walker and Delaria. And really, I think Xal'atath has more reason than most people to hate the other old gods given how they trapped her in a dagger for thousands upon thousands of years. Xal'atath apparently is also the reason why Sylvanas is not executed after Mulgore. Again, I am suspect of the leak, but the whole Sylvanas-Xal'atath thing, I would not be surprised if something like that came to happen. Anyway, content-wise, there apparently would be a partial revamp of the old world that unlocks once you hit level 50 and do the AOD like pre-quest. Now, this supposedly would involve Ungoro, Feralis, Desolus, and Mulgore being high-level zones, and Silithus being the endgame zone, presumably a bit like Suramar and Legion. Now, that would be at launch, but apparently they plan to then revamp the Eastern Kingdoms piece by piece as they move forward with the patches, with something apparently very special going on in Gilneas, Tirisfal, and the Plaguelands, with the leaker saying that there supposedly is like something that people know that is under the zone there. Now, that's kind of odd to me. Tirisfal, like, rumors existed for a long time, yes, but they were revealed to just be like a Cathaxi or Cathaxi general in Legion. So, is there more there? I mean, as for the Plaguelands, what? Are we dealing with the bones of the Paladins underneath Light's Hope? Is there maybe something else that could happen there? And then as for Gilneas, well, I think many people do want to see plot happen there, and I would not be surprised if that did actually happen. So, initially, you might think it's kind of small, right? Like Ungoro, Feralis, Desolus, Mulgore, and Silithus. That would be as many zones as Legion launched with, but I don't think people would find that acceptable given that they are pre-existing zones, even if the revamps are very heavy. Now, I think this could end up making sense if Blizzard were able to sell people on the future game patches being large enough to revamp multiple zones per patch. But I really think this would be quite a change in formula if they did do it. I have to imagine that this would involve stuff with the rest of the world, like from a systems perspective. And I suppose, therefore, if Blizzard said, hey, look, we know what we wanted to do with Cataclysm, we know where we made missteps, we know what's wrong with our game's world content, and in this expansion, we're putting the world back in World of Warcraft. If they successfully sold that, then I think many people might actually support that idea. Anyway, let's move on. So systems-wise, they're supposedly continuing onwards with an Essence-like system where you would earn skills and traits from level 50 to 60, kind of like old glyphs, and you would end up having 5 major sockets, 2 for passive traits, 2 for active skills, 1 for an alt. I mean, that could happen. I think if this was on a per class or spec basis, it could be a decent enough system. Then talent-wise, things have apparently also changed with you getting offensives and defensives per bracket, with there being 5 brackets of 4 talents, 2 defensive and 2 offensive per bracket, which, I mean, it's a bit odd. Maybe they do it, maybe they won't. I don't really see a major talent revamp coming though. But anyway, they also said there will be a conquest point leveling system past 60, where you would just earn those points on an account-wide basis. Now, these would be spent to get bonuses like increased damage and targets below 25% HP and run speed as the 2 examples, and this supposedly would be a replacement for artifact-like progression that's across all max level characters. Now, I think a system like this, that was more like the Guild Wars 2 Masteries and less stat-focused, I think that could be good, but putting vital combat things in this, I'm not sure how much of a good idea that would be, else they'd risk repeating some of the mistakes of both Legion and Battle for Azeroth in regards to balance. They'd be sort of penciled in, or pigeonholed in, or whatever, to having most of the power gains being front-loaded in the leveling for the sake of balance, and then boring incremental gains past that as you grind. Now, I'd love a system like this, but one that is not tied to stats and character throughput. I think there could be really fun stuff there. Perhaps, those effects could come from maybe more interesting gear, things like that, instead of a big new character progression system. But anyway, apparently the planned release date for this is Q4 2020, and that has been pushed back because of BFA, which would make a bit of sense. They are a little bit behind with Battle for Azeroth. Do remember that, this time in the Legion cycle, we were on Argus already, yet with BFA, we're only on its 0.2 patch. They are like a month or 2, maybe 3 behind schedule. So overall, does it seem reasonable to you? I think there's a bunch of guesses, there's a bunch of wildcards thrown in there, and it's the sort of thing where, yeah, you could choose some sure bets when you're trying to make a fake leak, and then you put in a few wildcards to get people talking. But I suppose it is a jumping off point to other things, like, would you like to see a big focus on the existing Azeroth versus a new continent? So I'd love to hear what you've got to think about all of that. But as for the end of Legion, well, they say that 825 will be setting up the N'Zoth Aftermath and just putting pieces in place for the expansion finale in Mulgore, apparently. So 8.3 is supposed to be Sylvanas' attack on Mulgore, and it will be a high-level zone with world quests that's similar to Mechagon. Then apparently Sylvanas is actually the final boss of the expansion, meaning that yes, we would have defeated but not killed every Warbringer, with Nathanos dying in the raid and Sylvanas being injured and captured. Now, as in this raid, apparently we are then defeated by N'Zoth's minions. They go on to attack all of us, with their goal being to kill Sylvanas, and the whole thing ends with Sylvanas being imprisoned and her sisters acting as her jailers, and if we read the other part of the leak, maybe Xal'atath frees her. Supposedly, that will be this year, with Mechanomes and Gill Goblins being an allied race in 8.3 or 8.3.5 as a part of the next expansion's pre-order, with factions not being merged at the end of this expansion, but with them being neutral in terms of the lore, and players having inter-faction group play and communication. Now, to be honest, I could see those coming in terms of features, the group play and the communication, and it doesn't sound like an absurd way to end this expansion. I've always thought that it's basically down to whether the final boss will be Sylvanas or N'Zoth, and if it was Sylvanas, I think this certainly would be a decent way to do it. Overall, though, I think this is just a decently constructed fake leak, but it's one that sparks off an interesting discussion that I think I had a lot of fun writing and doing. I suppose it won't be long, though, because 8.2.5 will probably just be a few weeks away in terms of it being in the PTR, and that will teach us a lot more about the future direction of the game. Next, though, we do have some rather sad news. Frank Pierce has left Blizzard. Now, Frank was one of the original company founders, although, as Frank would be quite quick to point out, the whole thing was actually sparked off by by Alan Adam. So the story here is actually simple enough. Alan was friends with Brian Fargo. Now, he ended up doing coding work over a bunch of years on Interplay games, and then in his final year, he decided to start a games company. And to do that, he recruited who he thought were the two best engineers in his class, Mike Morhaime and Frank Pierce. So as time went on, of course, Mike Morhaime ended up being the public face of the company, but Frank Pierce has been there for the entire time since then. For example, he was executive producer on the WoW expansions up to Mists of Pandaria, and he was the company's chief development officer. That's the role that he'd been serving for much of this time. So overall, he was more of a behind-the-scenes kind of guy when it came to running the company, and being real, they're often the most important people in running a company, so that just means we know a bit less about what he did, though he undoubtedly had a massive role at the company. Both Pierce and current Blizzard president J. Allen Brack issued statements, and really they're the usual type of goodbye letter that one would expect. And with Frank's departure, Alan Adam is now the only Blizzard founder left in the company. However, it's worth noting that he did leave the company in the early 2000s, only to return rather recently. And upon returning, he said that leaving had been a massive mistake, and that all that he really needed was a sabbatical, basically just a break away from the company, and that he'd actually been wanting to return for a decade. Alan now works on new projects at Blizzard, some of which are new IP. I believe he's running the kind of more sort of incubatory type part of the company that slurped up the likes of Tom Chilton, Corey Stockton, and Craig Amai. But overall, though, it's hard to read into Frank's departure. Could you say that the founders are leaving and they're being replaced with more corporately compliant people? I mean, you could say that. There might be a bit of truth to that, but to be completely honest with you, it's hard to read into that situation with all that much accuracy. So all we can really do is basically thank Frank for his years and years of work on a lot of products that have brought people a lot of joy, and wish him the best in the future. And with that covered, let's talk about the world first. Funny enough, this has actually had a little bit of drama. Essentially, Method were not that happy with their terms with Red Bull in the past, who basically wanted the event to be streamed on the Red Bull Twitch channel. Both parties were not able to come to terms, so Red Bull apparently started asking around supposedly before splitting with Method. Method then released a big TwitLonger post, which was quite smartly done. It capitalized on their already good PR to push Red Bull into a pretty hard spot. What's actually happened? Well, we've ended up with two major streams. We've got Red Bull from London and Method from the Take TV studio in Germany. It's one of the best setups we've seen overall. We've got Method raiding live, right? We've got them doing that, but we also have Limit and Pieces raiding live in London, as well as loads more guilds having their streams available and being reacted to on both the Method and Red Bull streams. And this gives us far more world-first content than we've ever had before. Now, while things may have been a bit rocky initially with that drama, I think this means it could be our largest race yet, which is really good. Then quality-wise, as of the time of writing, it's pretty clear that this isn't a one-boss raid. Ashvane was giving some guilds trouble. We had some new contenders. We had two new Oceanic guilds just appear, pulling into 3rd and 4th place at one point, which was quite surprising. So overall, it seems as if top-end WoW raiding is doing really darn well here. I suppose that's not much of a surprise, given how Uldir and Azshara Lore both did really well, but it's definitely nice to see. And next week, there'll be a lot more to talk about as the race tightens and our guilds get towards Azshara, especially if she ends up having that hidden phase, as some speculate. And I mean, even more especially if there's a bit of lore in that hidden phase. But again, we'll have to wait and see if that happens. So there you go, a fair few, not super game related, but I think still interesting Warcraft adjacent topics to talk about today. So let me know what you thought about them down below. Of course, if you want to help our efforts and also get a bunch of cool things mailed to you, then you can check out the Patreon. And yeah, with that, cheers, and I'll see you next time.